the populist right clearly have rejected neoliberalism. Now, he really has picked the wrong guy with Mises, because Mises was incredibly not racist for somebody from in Austria in the 1940s, right?
We're making the arguments for protecting domestic industry, protecting domestic jobs. It's entirely an antithesis to the origins of Hayekian thought.
If you don't believe anything that your supposed mentor believed, and in fact you believe the opposite of it, in what way are you a disciple?
Hello and welcome to this IEA briefing. My name is Reem Ibrahim. I'm a communications manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am delighted to be joined by Christopher Snowdon, our head of lifestyle economics. Hi, Chris. Chris has written in the forthcoming edition of Economic Affairs a review of a book by a guy called Quinn Slobodian entitled Hayek's Bastards, the Neoliberal Roots of the Populist Right. Chris, tell us about this book.
Okay, so this is the second book of Slobodian's I've read. He's actually quite an interesting character. Of all the kind of anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal writers out there, he does at least give you something new to look at and read. He's a historian, and I think actually probably a pretty good historian insofar as he really does his reading. He has read vastly more about the world of free market think tanks than I ever have, certainly. And he will cite the most obscure letters and conference presentations from decades ago from Montpellier Society or news articles from the 60s and 70s. He definitely has learned a lot about this whole area that we kind of work in. And yet he just seems to draw the wrong conclusion, or a conclusion that doesn't really follow from the evidence. He reminds me a bit of, do you know the director Adam Curtis makes the BBC documentaries? Do you know what I mean?
No, I don't know.
He does these increasingly pretentious documentaries that now only come out on the iPlayer because they're really 7 or 8 hours long. They're really interesting because he always finds some obscure story you hadn't heard before. The trouble is, by the end of it, you go, well, I don't know what he was really trying to say, or I think he was trying to say this, but that doesn't make any real sense. And it's a bit like that with Slobodian. He comes up with these quite interesting stories. Like his last book, Crack Up Capitalism, was all about libertarians attempting to create their own micronations, which is a fun subject, right? And none of these micronations have ever succeeded. Not because of the underlying philosophy necessarily, or the underlying economics. They kind of fall apart before they even begin because people just squabble with each other, or it turns out the bit of land they've got they don't really have the rights to, or it's completely arid.
But it's like free cities. That's kind of...
Yeah, it's a fun idea, and it would be nice if someone could get one going one day. But what Slobodian reads from these, admittedly, entertaining and eccentric anecdotes is that what libertarians and what the rich really are trying to do is leave society completely and go somewhere where they don't have to pay any tax and can follow their own rules, which they might be tempted to, but they don't really. That's not the end game of free market capitalism. This is just an interesting subplot from a handful of fairly odd people. So his new one, Hayek's Bastards, argues that if you want to understand the intellectual roots of the populist right and indeed the far right, you need to look at the work of Hayek and Mises. Much more so Mises than Hayek, actually. I think Hayek's only in the title because I guess he has greater name recognition with the people he's trying to sell books to. But he's picked the wrong people completely, because he characterizes the populist right as being primarily against mass immigration and therefore racist. He takes it as read that if you're against mass immigration, you must be racist. And he also applies some stuff in about what he calls race science, particularly the bell curve and all the stuff about IQ and race that derived from that in the 1990s. And he ties these things in with Mises to some extent, but mainly the people who followed Mises, and shows that there is a natural, in his view, progression from wanting to have free trade and all the things that people like Hayek and Mises believed in a free society, that you can directly trace from that kind of nativist economic policy, and in particular views on race and immigration.
And how is that connection made in the first place? I mean, this seems entirely an antithesis to sort of the political realignment theories that we're seeing over the last few years, where, I mean, basically the right have become increasingly nationalistic, but it's wholeheartedly against the free trade arguments that have been made by people like Adam Smith.
Right.
And of course, Hayek and Mises are in some ways a continuation of that kind of body of work. So how is this connection even made?
Well, what he's basically done, as far as I can see, is he's started with his conclusion and worked backwards. So he's decided that neoliberal think tanks have a great deal in common and in some ways subtly planted the seeds for people like Trump and Le Pen. And then he's just gone back and found any connection whatsoever he can with any of the people who were vaguely in the orbit of Hayekian think tanks. And of course, a lot of people have been in the orbit of the IEA alone, right? Let alone all the other like-minded think tanks and conferences and people around the globe. So he starts off with Mises. Now, he really has picked the wrong guy with Mises, because Mises was incredibly not racist for somebody from in Austria in the 1940s, right? It must have been the least racist bloke around at the time. He was very, very consistently pro-open borders immigration, never faltered on that. And yet Slobodian goes through his, how much he wrote, Human Action alone is 1,000 pages. He cherry picks a few quotes, which actually are perfectly innocent anyway, in fact, making an anti-racist point, and tries to suggest that although it's not clear cut that Mises was a racist, he says, you can see how other people might have interpreted these phrases and built a racist ideology on it. Yeah,
that's absolutely insane.
I know, it's crazy. And the same with Hayek. He doesn't even really try to cherry pick Hayek, but I mean, Hayek was not, didn't really write about it, I don't think. No. I mean, Mises did write about racism and Nazi.
He was vehemently against it.
He was extremely, he just scoffed at it, really, but he was clearly very much against it. But he then looks at the kind of second, third generation Misesians, people at the Mises Institute and so on. Now, it's true that there are one or two characters, in the, 70, 80 years of kind of neoliberalism as he sees it, who, some of them are genuinely quite unpleasant, right?
I remember the Mises Institute coming out in support of the anti-Bolsonaro protests, or was it pro-Bolsonaro protests? I honestly can't remember, over in South America. And I remember thinking, I don't think that's quite in keeping with Mises' thinking. But, this is... Organizations use the names of thinkers all the time without necessarily being, sort of doctrinal about it.
Exactly. So it's a question of, are you just cherry picking one or two people who kind of went off the reservation, or, is this a widely held view amongst people who admire Hayek and Mises? Was it even a widely held view by Hayek and Mises themselves? Clearly not. So he picks one or two people. He's probably on strongest ground when he talks about the paleoconservatives, Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell, who were, definitely very heavily involved in the Mises Institute. Murray Rothbard, I think, knew Mises. Now, they weren't, I don't think, racist, but they certainly tried to create a populist form of quasi-libertarianism in America, which didn't really last. But you can sort of see a link there.
But even Rothbard was open borders. I mean, Rothbard...
He was open borders until the last year of his life,
right,
when he, like a number of liberals, to be fair, they said, Mises never predicted the kind of the scale of immigration that we have now. Now, firstly, you need to remember, there is nothing racist about not being in favour of borders. Right?
That's a good fact.
Open borders is seen by most people as pretty much an insane view, right? It's incredibly unpopular, but it's not really held. It's not a view held by anyone except extreme libertarians and extreme communists. I don't even think Slobodian is probably in favour of open borders. I'm not sure, but just not being in favour of completely uncontrolled immigration doesn't make you a racist. That is the standard view of the great mass of humanity. But from Rothbard's kind of departure from that, which was based on him basically saying, I don't know if America will still be America if we allow literally everybody who wants to come here, right? So a commonly held view, not just on the right. But his solution to this was just to get the government out of immigration policy altogether by privatizing all land, right? So he still came up with a characteristically kind of libertarian stance on this, which was not in itself racist. Anyway, he keeps banging on about this stuff, and he bangs on about the IQ debate. which I don't know a great deal about. But my point is that he names various people who, from what I can tell, are or were wrong-uns and wouldn't be welcome at the IEA. But I'd never heard of them for the most part. And maybe that's a failing on my part, but I've been through free market think tanks for quite a long time. I've literally never heard of some of these people he's talking about, who he portrays as being like the most influential key figures in libertarian thought. And they're not. It's not unusual for people to start off libertarian and get more conservative as they get older, right? Same with, even more so, people start off on the left and become conservatives. There's plenty of people who start on the left and have moved to the populist right and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean there's anything inherent about socialist logic that is inherently
connected
racist
to populism.
Yeah, exactly. So he's gone about it the wrong way. If he was going about it in a neutral and methodical way, he would look at who are the main people on the populist right: Trump, J.D. Vance, Marine Le Pen, Bolsonaro, these people. Now let's have a look at their backgrounds. Let's see who they say are their kind of heroes and their intellectual forebears. J.D. Vance has written a whole book about this. J.D. Vance doesn't even get mentioned in Slobodian's book, nor do various other people. He doesn't even look at people like Musk, who probably would say that Hayek was somebody he looks up to. He just kind of picks some pretty obscure characters, makes them look more important than they are, and then say, well, look at this link that they had because they went to the Montpellier Society in 1986.
So there's no intellectual link. He's not saying these arguments are coherent with, because I mean, these arguments make absolutely no sense. What he's saying is some people that were libertarians or in libertarian spaces were also connected to the Trump administration or to populist people. Is that what he's saying?
Yes.
He's saying that they were in the same room. There's no intellectual argument being made.
Well, no, not really. I mean, not an evidenced one. He just says that the clues in the word Hayek's bastards, right? He's not saying these are the legitimate offspring necessarily, but they are the kind of natural offspring. He says that this, what he calls new fusionism, is a sort of mutant offspring of neoliberalism, but one that has a perfectly logical evolution. No,
I just do. But how is that argument being made from a sort of philosophical perspective? I mean, I don't know. I don't really understand how somebody can take the work of Hayek and Mises and forget about the physical people that work in politics that are engaged in the political cycle day to day. What has he taken from Hayek and Mises' work that he's now then connected to populism? Well,
very, very little. And there's several. I mean, nothing from Hayek. Some very, very out of context quotes from Mises, and then after that, it's people who were at the Mises Institute or were at some conference where Charles Murray was speaking or something like that. It's a bit of a convoluted web. I'm not saying it's not. The other thing he does, and I find this perhaps the most interesting thing about these books, because I'm not sure he realizes he's even doing this. He never really defines populism very well. It's fair enough. A lot of people struggle to define it. But if you're going to define right-wing populism in the current era, I would say there are three main strands to it. One is a rejection of globalization and indeed neoliberalism, free trade. Right? We're seeing the rise of tariffs, industrial strategy, subsidizing your own businesses. That's definitely a part of populism. Another part is anti-immigration, or anti-mass immigration, for sure. The other part is a rejection of neoconservatism, right? Particularly in America. America is not going to get involved in any more of these stupid foreign wars. Trump is kind of a pacifist on that score. So it's a rejection of neoconservatives and neoliberals, plus anti-mass immigration. And I guess you could also say anti-wokery in there as well, right? But people like Slobodian, they're obviously anti-neoliberalism. They're also, I assume, anti-neoconservatism. He doesn't say much about the foreign wars in Iraq and all this, but I bet you a pound to a pork scratching he has a very similar view to someone like Naomi Klein, who I think is a big influence on him. So actually, there's people like him have got a lot in common with the populist right. The only thing they really disagree on is immigration. And possibly, what he calls race theory or race science or whatever, the extent to which so-called race science is driving the opposition to mass immigration is obviously debatable. But I'm pretty certain that Slobodian is more comfortable with mass immigration than someone like J.D. Vance is. But this is almost the narcissism of minor differences. It's a horseshoe theory, really. The reality is that the populist right have taken on some of the core beliefs of the Naomi Klein no-logo generation of 25 years ago. They regret the Iraq War enormously. They don't like free trade. Now, their reasons for disliking these things are different. Generalizing enormously, the right don't like these foreign wars because they don't win them, and American soldiers die, whereas the left don't like them because they kill lots of civilians in the countries that were invading, and a lot of Americans.
And there's also the taxpayer money being spent on these foreign wars rather than protecting our own argument as well.
Yeah. Well, they wouldn't. I don't think they'd mind spending all the money if they won the war and got something out of it. But they just think these are. I mean, I kind of agree with them. These are pointless expeditions. The opposition to free trade, the right don't like free trade because they think that you're losing jobs.
Well, it's good old-fashioned mercantilism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, balance of payments to some extent. Very clear from Trump and his ridiculous tariffs that he takes a good old-fashioned mercantilist view of things. But it's also they think, well, we're becoming unemployed in our country. We've got a rust belt, blah blah blah. Whereas the left are more concerned about the rise of so-called sweatshops and the exploitation of foreigners. So they have different reasons why they oppose these things. But ultimately, it's horseshoe theory. They both oppose these things. They're both against neoliberalism and the neocons. So all Slobodian can really argue with them about is immigration. So he makes a huge deal about immigration and open borders and the supposed betrayal of open borders by people who claim to like von Mises. But this is more of a sibling rivalry and squabble. It's an interfamily squabble more than anything else. The populist right clearly have rejected neoliberalism. This is the point. He's trying to make out that they haven't because supposedly Hayekians are not too keen on immigration, which is obviously nonsense, but it's all he's got, really, if he's going to carry on blaming neoliberalism for everything, which is what he's been doing for the last 10 years. It must be quite hard for him, I think. For somebody who's been spending obviously a vast amount of time studying neoliberalism, has been critiquing it for about a decade, to suddenly find that the dominant force in politics these days actually isn't neoliberalism. Actually, there's a huge backlash against neoliberalism. And that backlash is driven by much similar motives to the left-wing backlash against neoliberalism that began back in the 1990s, where people were going around smashing up World Trade Organization meetings.
Well, it's so interesting because there seems to be a complete misunderstanding of the relationship between people like us, like sort of broader libertarians, and the populist right. I mean, we are being completely dejected by this. I mean, this is literally Steve Davies' political realignment theory, which is, as far as I can see, basically been proven right. I mean, the fact that Trump and so many other countries across the world have basically been able to reject free trade and reject globalization as they see it for economic reasons. I mean, people are saying, oh, Trump's tariffs, it's all part of the deal. You know, he's trying to gain, I think he's genuinely been making the arguments for protecting domestic industry, protecting domestic jobs. It's entirely an antithesis to the origins of Hayekian thought, which is, people like Adam Smith that argued for free trade. Yep. It is literally the complete opposite of it. So I really can't understand where these connections are being made.
Well, he's got to be in his bonnet. He spent a lot of time researching something, thinking that it rules the world, and he finds out it doesn't. So he has to kind of reverse engineer neoliberalism into what people are actually voting for, even though it's the kind of politics that me and you are no more happy with than we are with socialist anti-trade rhetoric.
So his conclusion is that these connections are so. I mean, the book. When was the book published?
Oh, a few months ago.
Right. Okay. Was it before Trump's?
It was published at an inconvenient time. It was clearly finished before Trump took power, but before but published after the tariff scam.
Right. Because you can't see. I mean, again, I don't think you could seriously defend any kind of connection between Trump and Hayek.
No, and the book's written in kind of a weird way as well. So he does all this stuff, looking back on the history of Hayekians and those that orbit them. And then he has a fairly random chapter about gold bugs. No, it's true that a lot of people in free market think tanks are quite keen on the gold standard and crypto and stuff like that. He focuses on it in Germany just because the AfD apparently have historically been quite keen on gold, which actually a lot of Germans are because of what happened after the First World War. They've got like a stock of money. But he thinks this is another sign that there's some connection between free market think tanks and the far right. And then just when you think he's going to crown it all off with, then Trump came into power and Elon Musk doing this and all these things, he kind of doesn't. He instead suddenly switches to Javier Malay. And I think perhaps that's because Javier Malay is the only person who actually does seem like he is, well, he actually genuinely is an admirer of Mises, and Hayek actually quotes him and so on. The trouble is he's not far right. I know some newspapers were claiming he was far right when he first came in, but he isn't by any standard. He is more or less a neoliberal, right? It's not a mutant form of neoliberalism. It's pretty much pure neoliberalism, pure Hayek, and he's not anti-immigration. I mean, Argentina for many, many years has been very, very pro-immigration, and so is Malay. The only way he can portray Malay as being far right is that Malay is not too keen on abortion, which most people actually aren't in Argentina.
Yeah, but I mean, also the South American context he can't take that away. I mean, they are incredibly religious and conservative people.
Yeah, and I don't think he's even talking about banning abortion anyway. I just think he personally
doesn't like it.
You know? So it's pretty strange stuff, isn't it?
Well, it's like, would you call Jacob Rees-Mogg far right, being personally anti-abortion? Right. I mean, I don't think you could. I don't think any sensible person...
People probably have. Sure.
Probably. Well, this reminds me of the Dominic Frisby song, we're all far right. Well, it does. And so what I really like is the last sentence in your article, the sort of shortened version of your article, where you make the connection between sort of the historical time in which this book was published and then Trump's tariffs coming in, and sort of thinking about, okay, I think the question you posed at the end of the article was, well, if Trump is Hayekian, what isn't Hayekian?
Yeah. Exactly. He's having to make everything look Hayekian because he's, I guess, buys into this idea that Hayekian think tanks secretly run the world. And therefore, anybody in power must be a Hayekian in some sense. But it gets into kind of weird conspiracy theory kind of language once you draw that conclusion. I mean, the reality is, if you don't believe anything that your supposed mentor believed, and in fact you believe the opposite of it, in what way are you a disciple? In what way are you a follower? It's quite possible, as he shows in the book, that you have people who were very much promoting free markets and capitalism in the 80s, who then went on to become economic nationalists, nativists, and indeed outright white supremacists. Yeah, but how much of that is a connection? Well, Hayek supported free market capitalism. These people supported free market capitalism, and some of them, fairly obscure figures, went on to be, rather nasty pieces of work. Look, if everybody did that, if everybody who supported free markets inevitably, as they got older, became white supremacists, he might have a point. Or if even more than a very, very trivial number did, he might have some kind of argument. But that's not what happened. And he can only make out that there is some kind of natural connection between free market economics and racism by cherry picking a handful of pretty marginal figures.
Well, it sounds like Hayek's Bastards is basically an argument made on absolutely nothing and some very, very strenuous connections. Tenuous connections, not strenuous, tenuous connections that have absolutely no basis in fact. And I'm quite shocked that basically the entire argument is made on the idea that some people might have been friends or in the room with other people that are
that's how it works, with the conspiracy
connections. It's insane. I mean, there is no logical reason for any kind of real strong connection between Hayekian economics and Trump or any populist.
Yeah, that's a fair summary. Right?
Indeed. Well, Chris, thank you so much. Where can we read this excellent book review?
There's a shortened version of it on the IEA Substack, and the full 4,000-word version will be in the next issue of Economic Affairs.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for joining me today. Thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you're interested in learning more about the IEA's work and indeed reading the shortened version of Chris's review, check out insider.iea.org.uk.